Good afternoon. I'm Rev Dave Thompson, and I'd like to welcome you back to our Civil Human Bible Study. I'm a civil human minister, and what that means is that I focus my ministry on building human peace and common ground. And the way that I do that is, in particular, with this Bible study, what I want to do is approach it with two ground rules. And the first is that I want to be human. And what I mean by that is that I want to approach these scriptures as just a human being on equal par with all other human beings and take the teachings out of it that I believe can be held across the board for all humans. And then second, I want to be civil. And what that means is that I want to respect those basic human needs that we all share. The need to believe what we want to believe about the unanswered questions of life that we can't prove to one another, our faiths, our creeds. The need to be independent from the control of others, the need to vote for those who will have control over us, the need to intimately love somebody, and then last, our ability to live our lifestyle the way that we want to live. As a result of this, I want to give you a quick overview of what's going to happen. So I'll read the text, and after that, we're going to talk a little bit about the culture and the influence and the language that might have affected this particular context, so we can better understand what these words might actually mean. And then last, I want to give you my paraphrase. It's kind of like my walk away, a translation of this text for modern days, for all humans across the board. So let's go ahead and read this first passage. And today Jesus is going to be talking about John the Baptist, who we've heard before in Matthew's book. But he's going to be telling us why John was such a great prophet and why he esteemed him so much. And we're beginning in chapter 11, verse 7. As they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who wear soft clothings are in kings' houses. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. For this is he of whom it is written, 'Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you.' Assuredly, I say to you, among these born of women, there has never been one greater than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to receive it, he is the Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." I want to give a little bit of cultural background in this context. It'll really help us understand what's being said. And then this passage today, there's a couple of verses that are often taken out of context and used, and I feel inappropriately, and even in today's society. So we'll be getting to those in a little bit. But first I want to talk a little bit about what a prophet is. Jesus calls John the Baptist a prophet greater than all the prophets and somebody who's greater than all that have been born. So what is a prophet? In the kingdom of Israel, in their land and in their culture and their history, there have been people who've come up throughout time who've been the sort of public speakers to call their culture and their public back to their core tenets of faith, to living a good life. It's really their moral compass. And the word itself actually translates as in front of and brings light in darkness. So it's the idea of revealing what is true about the world, about the situations with their leaderships, if they've kind of stepped away from their moral compass. And prophets were the ones to bring back people to look at the truth of what was happening and to see what they could do to change that. John, in particular, was really, really unique for his time. And this is why Jesus really esteemed him a great deal. There were a lot of prophets during that day. There were a lot of individuals who were standing up and leaders during Jesus' time to give their own account of what they thought should happen in the kingdom of Israel and to deal with the Roman occupation. But John was unique, and I want to tell you why. At this time, a lot of the religious leaders had become quite comfortable in their luxury, in the importance that they had in life. In general, their ease in life and the wealth that they had accumulated because they were in positions of power, and that created a system that required people to pay taxes and to pay into the system that they enjoyed. And so John is this individual who goes out and lives in the wilderness, and he is somebody who clothes himself with what's called camel hair, and that really is more like burlap. And those of you who know burlap, it's not a very comfortable clothing to wear. And he also eats locust and wild honey. So he's not indulging on lamb, he's not indulging on all the other wonderful aspects of eating, he's not indulging in soft clothing. His whole point was to demonstrate to the people of Israel and to the leaders they did not need luxury in order to be close to God, in order to be considered somebody who was great. That not having these things meant that you could still find contentment. It meant that you could still live a good life. It meant that you could be close to God. And another great thing about this, and I think Jesus points to, and we'll talk about that in just a second, is that John the Baptist is bringing sort of a history, the old prophets that wrote much of what the Jewish major prophets, their scriptures even today, and the Old Testament and the Christian scriptures, they were individuals who did much the same thing. So they took on a lot and gave up a lot in order to bring this message to the people without them thinking that they were doing that for financial benefit. So let me jump into some of the text here. There's an important couple of sections that are really going to help us understand what Jesus is saying. Okay, so he starts by saying this weird rhetorical question. What did you go out to see? A reed shaken by the wind? When I approached that the first time, I didn't really know what Jesus was talking about. It's pretty uncertain until you start looking at the Greek and you start looking at the language and understand a bit about what he's talking about, and it'll make sense. So the first basics translation issue that I want to bring to the forefront here, the reed is the simplest of plants. It's like just the regular thing that would be sitting out there in the wilderness. There's nothing special about it. And it's not a very strong plant. When it can be swayed and moved about by the wind pretty easily. And this word shaken, a reed shaken in the wind, means to be agitated or excited or disturbed. And then wind in this society can be speaking about spirit or movement, but it also means chaos, because you never know what the wind's going to do, and the wind is powerful in their culture. They don't have meteorology at this time. They just know that the wind happens, and they don't know why. And so when Jesus is saying that, did you go into the wilderness to see this simple reed blown about by the wind and tossed about? What he's essentially saying is, did you go into the wilderness to see some weak and feeble person who's all about the latest hype and conspiracy theories? No. And it's a rhetorical question. So he says, no, you didn't go out to see some feeble guy who's just following the latest fad and trying to purport the next conspiracy theories. So then he says, did you go out to see somebody dressed in soft clothing? Is literally how it translates. In this culture, soft was essentially it meant that these people had nice clothes. It meant that they had luxury. And Jesus makes a point of saying, did you go out to see somebody dressed in nice clothes? No, absolutely not. Why? Because people who dress in nice clothes live in king's houses. They live in the temple, really. These are the leaders of the day. Jesus is really pointing and separating the leaders from John the Baptist by pointing out the fact that he did not indulge in nice clothing, which of course he could have chose to in his life. In fact, the reason why they went out there is because they wanted to hear somebody who had a persuasive message. John was upsetting. And in fact, just before this yesterday, we talked about the fact that he's in prison, sending his disciples to inquire if Jesus is the Messiah. So John is facing a repercussion. He's upset the system because he's brought attention to the fact that the religious leaders are in fact living a life of indulgence, are living in luxury. Today, I'll leave it up to you to make the conclusions, but I do also see similarities. I do see in our culture those who are supposed to focus in ministry living in great luxury and in soft clothing and relaying the message that to have money means to have power, which means to be closer to God. And I think the message of John the Baptist could be really useful right now in noting that we don't need a lot of stuff in order to be somebody that's effective. And then Jesus said that he came to prepare the way. We talked about the Messiah a little bit yesterday, and essentially what Jesus is saying that this individual gave up his life and his ambitions to set the pace for Jesus. John knew that he was there to bring attention to turning away from the way that they were living, so that when Jesus came, that it would that he'd be able to pick up where John left off and run with it. And that's exactly what happens. And in fact, Jesus uses, when he says prepare the way, that word prepare, it's actually quite detail oriented. It's like taking a blueprint and using the correct tools to build a correct house that looks like the blueprint. So it's not just that, John happened to prepare the way by accident because he was just doing what he does. No, John was making a considerable effort to deny himself and to deny a lot of the luxuries in life because he knew that it was time for this great person to come into the Jewish society and to share the message that Jesus does. So one of the things that the translation that is often taken out of context, and he says, since the time of John, up until now, that's when Jesus is speaking just at his time, that the violence have taken by force the kingdom of God. The weird thing about this to me is the translations in a lot of the English scriptures translate it as the term violence, and the violent taketh by force. This term, though, is not necessarily the negative sense of violence that we give off when we use the word violent in our society. Hate and violence have a negative connotation. It's somebody who's taking advantage of somebody. This word really means assertiveness. It means aggressive assertiveness. And I think Jesus isn't saying here that, the people who are going to take the kingdom of God need to do it violently. He's saying that, look, people who are great are going to do things that are upsetting because they are aggressive and they're going to take aggressive measures. I want to give you my paraphrase of this text, and then I want to talk about a couple of walkaway points that I felt were really useful in this context. So here's my translation. Again, this is for a translation across all humans, regardless of their creed and their vote. It's my attempt to take these teachings and apply them in a basic way. As John's students were leaving to report back to him, Jesus started to speak to the crowds about John. What did you go into the wilderness to see? Some mentally disturbed guy rambling about the latest conspiracy theories? Or what else did you go out to see? A man dressed in designer clothes? Hardly. People who wear expensive clothes don't live out in the wilderness, they live in their mansions. So then, what did you actually go out to see? A prophet? Of course you did. And what an incredible prophet he was. All of this has to do with what was written. Pay attention, I am sending my messenger in full sight of you. He will skillfully prepare Israel, laying out their correct path before them. I promise you, there has never been a human born that is greater than John the Baptist, although in the Creator's universe and rules, everybody is equal. Since the days of John's ministry till now, the kingdom of heaven is being boldly advanced and is being rapidly taken hold of by equally bold people. All of our laws and spiritual leaders told us this would eventually happen, and if you're willing to accept it, John is the prophet. that we knew would be coming to prepare the way for the Messiah that we talked about yesterday. Those who have ears to hear the truth of this, let them hear it. That last phrase I just want to comment on. Jesus uses this a lot of times when he uses a lot of metaphor, and then he'll tag this saying on the end, those who have ears, let them listen. Essentially he's saying, I've just given you a secret message, pay attention to it. I want to give you just a couple of walkaway points today, and then talk a little bit about what's going to be happening tomorrow in our study. John is an incredible example and is often overlooked in the Christian scriptures as being just sort of a forerunner to Jesus. But Jesus himself points back to John and relays him as this individual that he himself holds up in the greatest esteem. And I think I wanted to and what I walked away from this passage feeling and understanding were just a couple of things about changing the world and what great people do. It takes people who will sacrifice their own self-indulgences to help change society. We've seen this in some of the greatest examples of our history. Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. We see it even today with people who are stepping away from their jobs to stand up and to protest injustice. We see this in individuals who are willing to put stuff on the line. And I want to encourage you, if you feel convicted to do something, if you feel like you want to participate or let your voice be heard, go for it. Make the sacrifice, take the time to go out and do something, because you can change society. And then one thing that I do love about this is that Jesus points to John the Baptist, who's in the past, and he's not about himself, but he brings the truth that sometimes we need to look to the leaders of our past to see how we can be leaders today. And just like I pointed out, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., there's a number of different leaders in the past who've helped change our society for the best. I might encourage you to go back and to read. Gandhi has an excellent autobiography. I'm not familiar if there's an autobiography. I'm sure there's several biographies about Martin Luther King Jr. But nonetheless, going back to study how these people did this, and then we can apply those same rules today. And last, if you are being part of a movement, we need to find bold people if we're going to do bold things. I know myself, working to build human peace and common ground, especially in this climate today, is not an easy task. And it means that there need to be bold people to stand up for it. I know that there are several of you who are tired of the division, who are looking for a society that can hold on to a safety and a comfort and a peace, that society can work together, that we can gel together without having so much violence and so much hate. I might encourage you to be bold and to find those other people who are equally bold and who are equally challenging to the society and want to do something. Get together with them and bring them on board, because you're going to be able to have that much more impact on people. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about how we should deal with people who refuse to listen or to change. And that's something that I know that I can identify with a number of my friends, especially in these days where talking about things that we wish that they would come to the center on, and not necessarily the extreme opposites. Sometimes it's tough to make people listen or change. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how John the Baptist and how Jesus does that and gives us a bit of a formula for doing that. And until then, I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being a part of this Bible study. And I appreciate your comments and your suggestions and your questions. So please leave those in the comments below. And I'll try to respond to those as quickly as I can. And until tomorrow, live at noon on Facebook, I want to say to you that I love you. And I hope that you choose to love yourself. It's the only love that we have any control over in this world. And now I invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving our neighbors the same way. Thank you.